Have you ever stopped to think about how, different cultures experience something like time or work? We're going deep today into the world of tribal communities in 19th century India and exploring how their lives were kind of reshaped by British colonial rule.
It's fascinating because we're not talking about a single tribal experience here, but a whole spectrum of lifestyles, ranging from those who moved with the seasons to those deeply rooted in a particular place, each with its own relationship to the environment.
So not like a simple, one-size-fits-all existence for these communities.
Not at all. We're talking about groups that interacted with their surroundings, their communities, even the world, in very distinct ways. To understand the real impact of British colonialism, we need to first understand these diverse ways of life, before they were significantly altered.
Okay, so picture this. Imagine like a calendar dictated by nature's rhythm, not a clock on the wall.
Right.
We're talking about Jujam cultivators.
Exactly.
They practice shifting cultivation, which sounds almost kind of poetic when you describe it. Cutting treetops, burning vegetation to clear and fertilize, scattering seeds, and then moving to new fields after harvest.
Exactly. And this wasn't just random or haphazard. Ginham cultivation was deeply connected to the forest's ecosystem. It allowed the land to regenerate, it prevented soil depletion, but importantly, it depended on free movement and access to land, something that would become increasingly difficult under British rule.
I'm already sensing a conflict brewing here. Why would the British, why would they want to disrupt a system that seemed to work so well with nature?
It was a clash of worldviews, really. The British, they saw settled agriculture as progress, right? It was a source of steady revenue, a way to control things. They saw the cultivators' way of life as, backward, an obstacle to their vision of an organized and taxable society.
Ah, so it wasn't just about farming techniques, it was about power, right?
Absolutely.
Did this tension between kind of tribal ways of life and British policies, did that play out in other groups too?
Absolutely. Take the Khans, for example. These hunter-gatherers in Orissa, they were incredibly connected to the forest. It provided everything: food, medicine, materials for dyes and trade. Their knowledge of plants, animals, the seasons, it was remarkable. But this reliance on the forest made them vulnerable, especially when the British started controlling land and resources.
So their deep connection to the forest became a point of weakness.
Precisely. As they were integrated into the colonial economy, right, they became more dependent on trade and vulnerable to exploitation. They found themselves increasingly treated as outsiders in their own land.
That's a tough situation. So we've got the Geom cultivators facing restrictions on their movement, the Khans dealing with pressure on their forest resources. What about herders? Did they face different challenges?
Definitely. Pastoralist groups like the Vengujars, the Labadis, Gaddis, Bakarwals, they adapted to different environments, moving with the seasons. Their lives revolved around constant movement, right? Following grazing lands. And this nomadic lifestyle, again, clashed with the British desire for fixed settlements, for clearly defined land ownership.
So their way of life just simply didn't fit the British mold.
Exactly. And the British often struggled to understand that different ways of life could be just as valid and successful as their own, right? They imposed their own ideas, often without considering the ecological realities or the complexities of these diverse tribal societies.
Speaking of complexities, didn't the settled cultivators already experience shifts within their own societies even before the British arrived?
Yeah. Groups like the Mundas of Chattanooga, they had begun using the plow, transitioning to settled agriculture. This led to changes in land ownership, clan ownership, giving way to individual rights, and, the emergence of social hierarchies within tribal groups.
So even within these communities, things were changing, sometimes leading to greater inequality.
Yes. This transition often brought greater social complexity and in some cases, inequality that mirrored the broader Indian society.
Wow, so we're seeing like a dynamic picture already of tribal life in 19th century India. But I'm curious, how did British colonialism directly impact these different ways of life? What were the key ways they asserted control?
Well, one significant way was by transforming the role of tribal chiefs. Before the British, these chiefs held real power, They controlled land, they enforced local rules, they were the traditional leaders. But under British rule, their authority was systematically weakened.
So they were stripped of their power.
Well, not exactly. It's more complicated. They were turned into intermediaries between the colonial administration and the tribal communities, forced to enforce British rules on their own people. It was a clever strategy, right, to undermine traditional leadership and sow distrust.
That's a tough position to be in, enforcing rules you didn't create on your own people. Does this strategy actually work?
It certainly created tension and resentment, but the British had other tools at their disposal, right? Especially when it came to dealing with the Jom cultivators. A major turning point for them and many other tribal communities was the land settlement process.
What did that entail?
Well, the British, they were obsessed with creating settled peasants, right? For revenue and control. They wanted to measure the land, define individual rights, set fixed taxes. This process completely clashed with the Jom cultivators' way of life, which relied on shared land and cyclical movement.
So they were trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly, and the consequences were often dire. Jom cultivators, forced to adopt settled agriculture in unsuitable environments, saw their yields plummet, leading to hardship and poverty.
So they were punished for trying to conform
Ex-
to a system that didn't work for them. That's a clear example of how the British imposed their ideas without regard for the existing realities. But their impact went far beyond agriculture, didn't it? Didn't the declaration of forests as state property have huge implications for all the tribal communities?
Absolutely. The creation of reserved forests meant that the British essentially carved out vast areas, declared them off limits, to the very people who had lived there for generations.
So they were being shut out of their own homes.
Essentially, these reserve forests, they were meant to protect timber resources, right? Resources that the British needed for their industries and railways. Tribal communities were suddenly restricted from moving freely, from practicing jum cultivation, gathering fruits, hunting. It was as if their traditional ways of life were being criminalized.
I can't imagine the frustration and anger. But they didn't stop there, did they? They needed labor to exploit those resources.
You're right. That's where the creation of forest villages comes in. The British, they offered jum cultivators small plots within the forest, but with a catch.
What was the catch?
These villagers were now obligated to work for the forest department, cutting and transporting trees, essentially participating in the destruction of their own environment for measly wages.
It's incredibly manipulative. It seems like this pattern of exploitation extended beyond the forests as well, didn't it? Weren't traders and moneylenders also a problem?
Yeah, their increasing presence in tribal areas created new forms of economic hardship and dependence. Take the Santhal silk growers, for example. They produced, high-quality silk, but they were caught in a web of exploitation.
How so?
Traders would give loans and then buy their cocoons at rock-bottom prices, only to sell them for much higher prices elsewhere. The Santhals, they barely scraped by, while the middlemen, they made huge profits.
So they faced restricted access to resources,
Right.
forcing them to rely on traders who then exploited them through unfair practices.
Yeah.
It was like a recipe for poverty and dependence.
Exactly.
And the exploitation didn't end there, did it? The British also needed labor, right? For their tea plantations and coal mines.
Yes. Tribal communities became prime targets for recruitment into these industries, which were vital to the colonial economy. But the conditions were often brutal.
So we're talking forced labor.
Well, not always explicitly forced, but the recruitment was often deceptive and coercive. Contractors would lure them with false promises, and once they were there, they'd face grueling work, minimal wages, and restrictions on their movement.
So these industries thrived on the suffering of the tribal populations who were treated as disposable labor.
Unfortunately, yes.
This is a lot to absorb. It seems like every aspect of tribal life was disrupted or exploited in some way.
It was a difficult time, and their suffering sparked numerous rebellions, uprisings throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. They fought against the changes in laws, the restrictions, the new taxes, the exploitation. One of the most iconic figures of resistance from this era is Birsa Munda. His story embodies the resilience of tribal communities against overwhelming odds.
His name is familiar. What made his approach so unique?
Birsa's story truly highlights the clash between tradition and modernity. That was happening across India during this time. He was born into a Munda community, already grappling with the changes brought by British colonialism. But he also experienced missionary schools and other outside influences. It sounds like his upbringing was almost like opposite ideas and experiences.
Yeah, a real blend.
Yeah.
So how did this shape him, like as a leader?
Well, as a young man, Birsa heard stories, about past Munda uprisings. tales of a time when they were free from oppression. And these stories, they stuck with him, especially as he saw the hardships his community faced under British rule.
So almost like a seed of defiance was planted in him through these stories.
Precisely. But it wasn't just the past. Attending a missionary school exposed him to Christian teachings. While he ultimately rejected those teachings, this experience shaped his understanding of leadership and social reform.
He was kind of taking pieces from different traditions and shaping his own unique worldview.
Yeah.
Almost like searching for a way to revitalize Munda society while resisting the forces that threatened it.
That's a great observation. He later spent time with a Vaishnav preacher, further expanding his understanding of spirituality and social reform. Bursa was a seeker, absorbing ideas from various sources and synthesizing them into his own powerful vision.
I see a parallel here with how the Jung cultivators adapted to new environments. Bursa adapted to a new intellectual and spiritual landscape,
Yeah,
drawing from different traditions to kind of forge a path for his people.
that's a fascinating parallel. And this ability to adapt and synthesize, it became crucial to his leadership. By the 1890s, Bursa started preaching his own message, a message that resonated deeply with the Mundas and other tribal groups suffering under colonial rule.
What was at the core of his message? What was he calling for?
Well, Bursa's movement was multifaceted. He urged the Mundas to reform their own society, give up harmful practices, clean their villages, reject superstition. He believed internal reform was essential for strengthening the community from within.
So it wasn't just about like fighting the British, but also empowering the Munda community to take charge of their own destiny.
Exactly. Bursa also fiercely opposed colonial rule. He saw the British, moneylenders, landlords, missionaries, all as Dikus, outsiders who exploited and oppressed the Mundas. He called for their expulsion and the establishment of Mundaraj, a self-ruled kingdom free from outside interference.
So he was advocating for both internal reform and external resistance.
Yeah.
Like a two-pronged approach to reclaiming their power and autonomy. It's a pretty powerful message. I mean, one that clearly struck a chord with those yearning for change.
Absolutely. And his message resonated because he didn't just criticize the present, he offered a vision of a glorious past, a golden age when the Mundas were prosperous and self-sufficient. He used this vision to inspire hope and rally people around a shared identity and purpose.
It's like he was tapping into the collective memory of the community, reminding them of their strength and resilience, and showing them that a better future was possible if they were willing to fight for it.
Precisely. Burr's vision wasn't just nostalgia, it was a call to action, a reminder that they had the power to shape their own destiny. His message resonated beyond the Munda community, inspiring other tribal groups to join his movement.
So we're talking about a movement gaining traction, challenging British power, offering hope to tribal communities. How did the British react to this, to this growing threat?
The British were alarmed by the movement's popularity and its anti-colonial message. They recognized the potential for it to disrupt their rule and undermine their control over resources and labor. Their response was swift and brutal.
It seems like force was kind of their go-to solution when their authority was challenged, especially in their colonies. What actions did they take to suppress the movement?
They used their typical tactics of repression, arresting key leaders, cracking down on gatherings, and using violence to intimidate and disperse Bursa's followers. Bursa himself was arrested in 1895 and imprisoned for 2 years for rioting.
So they tried to, silence him by taking away his freedom. A classic tactic.
Yeah.
But did it work?
Not at all. Bursa's spirit remained unbroken. Upon his release in 1897, he resumed his activities with even greater fervor. He traveled from village to village, rallying his supporters, using traditional symbols and language to mobilize people.
So leveraging the cultural and spiritual core of the community, using familiar imagery and language to inspire resistance. Almost like he understood the power of storytelling and symbolism to unite people for a common cause.
Exactly. Bursa's movement was about reclaiming Munda identity and culture, asserting their right to self-determination. This resonated deeply with those who felt increasingly marginalized and dispossessed.
It's a good reminder that resistance movements are often about much more than specific, grievances. They're about dignity, identity, the right to shape one's own future. But things escalated, right? Didn't Bursa's followers start targeting symbols of British power?
Yes. Bursa urged his followers to destroy Ravana, which was a symbolic representation of the oppressive forces that they faced, both British and local. This led to attacks on police stations, churches, and the property of moneylenders and landlords. The movement was becoming more militant.
So they moved from like protests and speeches to direct action, striking at the heart of the colonial power structure, a dangerous but often necessary escalation when peaceful means are ignored.
And the British responded with even greater force, determined to crush the rebellion before it could spread further. Tragically, in 1900, Bursa died in prison, likely from cholera. His death was a huge blow to the movement, which gradually faded without his leadership.
So even though Bursa's movement didn't achieve its ultimate goal of a Munda Raj, it must have had a lasting impact. It forced the British to at least recognize the grievances of tribal communities, right?
Yes. The Bursa movement, along with other tribal uprisings, forced the colonial government to introduce land reforms aimed at protecting tribal lands from outsiders. It was a small victory,
Yeah.
but a significant one nonetheless.
Yeah, it shows that even in the face of overwhelming power, resistance can create change. It can force those in power to acknowledge injustice and make changes, even if they are incremental.
Precisely. And perhaps even more importantly, Bursa's legacy lived on, inspiring generations of tribal activists and leaders who continued to fight for the rights and recognition of indigenous communities.
So Bursa's story is both tragic and inspiring. It reminds us of the devastating impact of colonialism, but also of the enduring power of resistance and the courage of those who challenge injustice.
His story also raises important questions about the legacy of colonialism, questions that are still relevant today. You know, how do we reconcile with the past? How do we address the ongoing inequalities and injustices faced by indigenous communities? These are complex questions, but Bursa's story provides valuable insights and inspiration.
Yeah, this deep dive has been really eye-opening, exploring the lives and struggles of these communities. But let's zoom out a bit and connect this to the bigger picture. What are some of the broader lessons we can learn from this exploration of tribal life and colonial transformations?
That's a great question, and one that we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at the lasting impact of colonialism on tribal communities and how their stories of resilience and resistance continue to inspire us today.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive,
Yeah.
exploring the lives of tribal communities in 19th century India and the immense challenges they faced under British colonial rule. As we kind of wrap up, I'm particularly interested in like connecting these historical experiences to the present day. What are some of the enduring legacies of colonialism that still impact indigenous communities today?
Well, one of the most significant is the ongoing struggle for land rights and control over resources. As we've discussed, the British systematically dispossessed tribal communities of their lands, disrupting their traditional ways of life, creating patterns of economic dependency that really persist to this day.
So the issues of land ownership and economic justice that we explored in the context of 19th century British colonialism, they're still very much alive in the 21st century.
Absolutely. Many indigenous communities around the world continue to face pressure from governments, from corporations, other powerful interests who seek to exploit their land and resources for profit. The fight to protect ancestral lands and maintain control over traditional resources, it remains a central struggle for many indigenous peoples.
It sounds like the battle for self-determination that Bursa Munda and other tribal leaders fought for over a century ago is still being waged today, just in different forms.
That's a powerful way to put it. And this struggle is often intertwined with the fight to preserve cultural identity and traditional knowledge. You know, we saw how the Khan's deep connection to the forest was both a source of strength and a point of vulnerability. For many indigenous communities, their relationship with the land, the environment, it's not just about practical resources, it's deeply spiritual, it's cultural.
So it's a way of life, a worldview that's inextricably linked to the land.
Exactly. And when indigenous communities are dispossessed of their land, they are losing a fundamental part of their identity, their history, their very being.
That makes the stakes incredibly high. And it kind of leads to a question that's been on my mind throughout this whole deep dive. How do we reconcile with this history of dispossession and exploitation? How do we move forward in a way that acknowledges the past,
Right,
while addressing the ongoing injustices faced by indigenous communities?
It's a complex question, but I think a crucial first step is simply listening to the voices of indigenous peoples, understanding their perspectives, and respecting their right to self-determination.
So it's about shifting the power dynamics,
Yeah.
giving indigenous communities a genuine voice in decisions that affect their lives and their futures.
Precisely. And this shift in power must be coupled with concrete actions to address the systemic inequalities
Yeah.
that continue to marginalize these communities. This means supporting land rights movements, promoting sustainable development that respects indigenous knowledge and practices, ensuring equitable access to education, healthcare, other essential services.
So it's about going beyond symbolic gestures to real tangible change. That empowers indigenous communities
Yeah.
and creates a more just and equitable future for everyone.
Exactly. And I think we can draw inspiration from the stories of resilience and resistance that we've explored in this deep dive. The tribal communities of 19th century India, they faced unimaginable hardships, but they never surrendered hope. They fought back against oppression. They adapted to changing circumstances, and they preserved their cultural identity in the face of enormous pressure.
Yeah, their stories are a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit, it endures. Resistance is possible, and change can happen, even if it's slow and incremental.
Their stories offer valuable lessons for all of us. They remind us of the importance of standing up for what is right, protecting the vulnerable, respecting different ways of life, and working towards a more just and sustainable future for everyone.
This deep dive it's been truly illuminating, highlighting the lives, the struggles, the resilience of tribal communities in 19th century India. And it's clear that their experiences, they're not just a chapter in a history book. They're part of an ongoing story, a struggle for justice and equality. That continues today.
Yeah. And their stories of resilience and resistance offer valuable insights for navigating the complexities of our world today.
As we conclude this deep dive, I hope our listeners are left with a deeper understanding of these communities, their enduring legacies, and the lessons they offer for creating a more just and equitable world for all.